Hello. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read just one passage from my novel, They Drag Them Through the Streets. The novel centers on a group of 5 friends who undertake a series of small-scale bombings to protest the Iraq War. The brother of one of these friends was a veteran of the war who committed suicide upon his return. Eventually, one of the 5, Zechariah Berkman, or Z, as he's often called in the novel, is killed in an explosion, seemingly in preparation for one of these actions. The narrative is structured around these 2 deaths, the veterans and the activists. The novel is narrated in turn by the 4 remaining friends, Ford, Vivian, Sarah, and a character known as A. I'm just going to read one excerpt tonight. You'll notice that throughout the characters' names often dissolve into initials as a sort of intimate shorthand for one another. I think that's everything you might need to know. I consider the genres: interview, manifesto, lead, love letter, flower on gravestone. Flowers on gravestones, which somehow never rot in a cemetery I walk through daily. I've noticed this, the petals never damp and stinking. Someone must come by to neaten up. Lead. The other day, I went to a fundraiser with Speeches, a group that builds schools over there that brings, really, packets of pencils, notebooks, and prosthetic limbs. Workbooks in 2 languages, theirs, ours. A had called me and told me to go. A journalist friend of hers was speaking about his 2 trips to the war unembedded. He was good-looking, that I acknowledged. He talked passionately about the people. You can't write a love letter to a whole people, I ought to have said to him. My chair was hard and uncomfortable. I did say something to him afterward. I shook hands with him, his warm, soft palms. You shouldn't be so vague, I said, which was a blow. I could see that in his eyes. But I was right. But he has been places I haven't. He has seen the streets after the soldiers left, the checkpoints absent, and children setting up stands on the corners, handing out juice to passing cars. But this is not the stuff of love letters either. This is what I mean to clarify. Nor when the women in front of the cameras wail, that's the only word for it, and beat their chests, crying the names of children, husbands, brothers lost. This is something else, just as I do not write for Z or to him or anyone. I clapped politely at the journalist's speech. The clapping like the click of a shutter. The journalist had clicked through a slideshow of photographs, including a series from a morgue. It was so terrible, he said, I took pictures mechanically. The bodies weren't whole, limbs piled up. They could no longer assemble them as bodies, but leg, leg, arm, arm. There were, terribly, heads. One watched the photos click by, the clicking not quite as soft as hands clapping, not the same. But how did they know that this leg, for instance, didn't belong with this arm, this head, this hand? Perhaps no one had looked closely enough to see how this wrist bone might resemble that ankle, how this sock might match fingers that could have pulled on it, old habit, a child's thin calves. I should have raised my hand to say, there's nothing mechanical to it, only human. What do you know? The journalist should have answered me. And how vague it must feel and impossible to try to bring back a whole country. Even the easiest moments, the greetings and muttering the interpreters talked over, the tea one was offered, the aid packages stacked in truck beds and argued through checkpoints. He said people there kept asking the same questions of anyone who talked to them, the most urgent questions. Cameras documented this or that explosion, but were absent the hours a family sat by their window watching the sniper watch the street, the dogs and cats in the street. Sometimes the sniper shot the dogs, out of boredom or dedication, or it could be there was no way to know otherwise, so that the bodies still on the streets would not be further desecrated. if that's what dogs did, or one could call it natural, before their families could come for them. It was the journalist who told me about the dogs. I learned this from him. "Thank you," I said after the speech and shook his hand, thinking as I did that this hand had held A, but he could never claim he knew her better than I did, differently, but never better. Love letters. This thought isn't mine, was born in an interview. When I read your novels, the interviewer said, they seem to me to be love letters. She didn't say to Z, but that's what she meant, I was sure. I didn't answer at first. I'm never sure what to say when people say these things. What do they think of him, now that even the war is old news? She and I waited for each other. That's interesting, I finally said, realizing that it must be more my turn than hers. Have you ever thought of your writing this way? No, I said, which wasn't quite true. I had thought, one cannot write for the dead. I thought she'd take my denial as a compliment, but instead she tipped her head sideways and waited. One cannot write for the dead, I said. Is this sincerity, I wondered? But wouldn't you say people write for the dead all the time, that that's exactly what they're trying to do? But failing, I said. All right, trying, but failing. All right, I said, we agree, but I don't think this is what I am failing at. She waited. You see, I didn't write to him when he was alive. Write to him? She hadn't been thinking of Z then. Zechariah, I said. I'm sorry, Zechariah Berkman. Isn't that who we were talking about? You know the story? I didn't mean. Her eyes widened. I waved a hand. Never mind, I said. But one can't write a love letter generally. One always writes to, you know. But it's like soldiers' letters home. They're only interesting if you imagine who loosens the flask of the finger and thinks of how he sealed it. The letters themselves are nothing. Or the journalists, I said. They don't file these reports, bombings in the background, thinking of people. There's someone they think of when they wire their latest. That's how it works. One doesn't go down into the morgue the day after the siege for no one. One looks at the bodies and thinks who they might be, how much hands are like hands, how similarly all our skin holds, then writes. Her job, of course, was to take notes, not to have a conversation. I watched her type. Ford and I already did it, Sarah had said to me the night Z died. She had come to get me. I must have been sitting on the kitchen floor for hours. The refrigerator was too loud and cars kept going by. We went to identify him, she said. You don't need to go. It was hard, she added, which I understood to mean the state he was in. We should go to A's, she said, and slipped her hand around my elbow, hard to pull. I wasn't sure why this should be next, but I followed her. By then it was nearly morning. How lucky that I wasn't in that country where had an explosion claimed him, I couldn't have just sat where I learned of it, just sat. The planes above still coming, or the sirens rushing toward. It was not like that here. No one would worry that they'd look for a body, check everywhere thinkable, and find no one, nothing. Limbs they'd have to sort through to see, and even then bury what? A left arm? And the death squads buried their victims everywhere. They don't keep records. It wasn't like this here. I sat for hours, against my back the heat of the refrigerator. You dedicated this novel to A, the interviewer asked. Can you talk about that? Yes, but I didn't write it for her, I said. It was just afterward that I dedicated it because I knew I should have. Should have? She was so slow. Should have written it for A, I said. I am no different from anyone, I said after a pause. I was thinking of that journalist. I threw up outside after, he'd said, standing before the slideshow on a screen, one body's imperfectly closed eyes, lids too swollen. He thought we would sympathize. But you were one of the last people to see them, I thought. Didn't you owe them more than to let disgust be your last gesture, the last thing they were offered? To sit and watch them, watch the flesh bruise and dampen on the stone, what had been blossoming, becoming decay. No one coming through that place to tidy, and why should they tidy? That's not what we owe each other. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see you out there. Hilary, thanks for reading with me. It was lovely. All right, this light doesn't work, so it means I've got to use these glasses. This is a novel. I don't know if anybody's looked inside it, but I just want you to see that that's what it looks like. Okay, so I think we've called it a variety of things, but it's a novel in sentences. So I will be reading single sentences to you, and I'll read from a couple of different parts, and I'll tell you the titles of the parts that I'll be reading from. It's a novel that spans the last several months of the mother's life, and then the next 6 months or so after her death. And it's not really necessarily about her, though, and you'll see what it is. I guess we'll take some opinion. We'll see together. All right. This first part is from before the mother's death. It's from a section called Politics, and this particular part is called Nothing Wrote, Nothing Preconceived. Rejoicing in my own quiet but occasionally soul-slapping way. Maintaining tension, modulating it. Full moon, mooning around. Holding on to a secret has its price. You pay until you can't. Like a good analyst, like a good mother, a story holds a sliver of perfection. Some organizing part of me goes dumb. No ledge, no circle of earth, no leg. Shaping, you kill. Some half-assed Michelangelo chipping away. Bliss? One line for me and another line for me. Within her sight. Suffer deprivation patiently. How about saying om and calling it a day? Reveal how revelation occurs. These spasms of sex a little like sobs. Just one long familiar book with gods and goddesses. Fiction, right? Fragment by fragment. Around and down various paths, having taken myself down to the nails. Either way divided, preparing to believe. A lifetime of no's, a second of immortality. I'm supposed to listen to my mother flail around in outer space, then put down the phone and eat my dinner. Feels like homicide, rather than suicide. These words, a kiss you can't refuse. No guarantee. Simply to stare at the blank page, which is, as I've said, a version of her face. Splaying myself, being splayed. Who decides an alter ego? You do, no doubt. Shouldn't I be reading? Very sort of happy, cheerful, lively, and lighthearted. There's the problem of desire, and when that's not a problem, there's the other one. I turned. Corners open out, edges turn in, opposites dissolve in a unity that contains everything, including small sexual indiscretions. The absolute luck of that occurrence. No regrets, no turning back. Begin here. How to say anything at all without suggesting the body's acute silence. Sort of myself sort of not. Religion and sand go in the same box, sometimes inhabited by a god. Fleet things do occur, a swift presence in the quick burning oxygen of a brain. Thought I loved you without knowing. Always dreaming hard, call it tears, licked his shin, you go in with the light and come out into the dark. Accidental connections, artistic reveries, messy. Not much of a self to sell or fight for. Clouds may look distinct, merge in the blink of an eye. A neatly tied up package, eminently penetrable. Sex sews up the borders. Okay, that's one section. Water for 1 second. Thank you. This next part is from a section called Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead. And this is the section in which the mother dies. You will not, I'm not going to read that part now. Need to put things in order. Take a walk on a treadmill. Translate something. Be translated. What I really like to do, write between the lines. The sky is mute, nothing blue to it. The sea is immense and calm. We discovered the peahen had been sitting on hollow eggs. This is my way of speaking to you, almost in the present tense. 30 seconds of rain, roses, dollops of frosting. Ate chocolate, came back to life. Touching you from an uncanny distance. Walked to the beach at noon, swam, then back up the hill. Lunch was grilled food, my husband, my chef, and the food we make of each other. This lively animation. Cats prowl in the vines above the roses. Writing makes the present. What meditation does, stretches time, digs into it. The God, procured in full knowledge. Just emptiness surrounding the hemispheres. Always mosquitoes now, mid-May. But one need not be wedded to silence. You understand, to escape awareness of time only to have it burst upon you at odd moments. An audible syllable, the only outcome of that journey. I'm breathing for you. There are levels and levels of intimacy. You never know. Look at, not back. His ego may squash mine. To bear sexual witness, is there such a thing? Figure out a way to shine at home. He's cooking for me, I'm exposing him in a piece I can't stop sacrificing on the altar of my body. But this gift is for him, simmering. Putting your money where your mouth is, always a gamble. Here, now, tomato sauce that's been cooking for over an hour. It's the cinnamon that fills the house and makes you think you might be hungry even if you know you're not. This is my husband's doing, and then it begins again. Cut to politics. As a child, I loved these long, almost summer days. Now I'm more interested in the dark before dawn. Just lust. Fine now, we are fine, and I have resolved my begin with generosity as a value and see where you stumble. The birds go crazy when we fuck. In the stew, stirring things around, whisking things together, tasting, I can turn away from this concoction and you're still there looking at me. Huge gusts of wind between pauses. And your sexual greed, where do you place it on a continuum? I watched that line of ants arduously, marchingly carry a piece of something we neglected to put in our mouths. Pulled so taut by time, I'm almost always. Someone just arrived noisily with something. I can hear them stowing it. the life and the spaces between the sentences. Walked with him through the gorge to the beach, swam, sometimes turned other and inside out, proofing my galleys. A gull flew over me so directly that I was able to understand just how narrow, like a blade, a bird makes its body in order to fly. Sucking and weeping at once. Just anything that occurs at any moment. But what I don't want to give up, the theory of your eyes. Thank you.
Hello. We're going to chat for a bit, but I want you all to chat with us.
Or open with questions.
Or open with questions. I want to start by saying I'm privileged to have a special relationship to Anne's novel, in that I co-edit with the poet Zach Savage the series at Rescue Press that published her book. And we call it the Open Prose series, which is a way of trying to invite or incite experiments in prose and maybe work that was on some edge between nonfiction and fiction, or fiction and poetry. Work that was really thinking about and aware of its form. And you can see why Anne's work was so exciting to encounter as we were reading for that. And it's been so wonderful to get to work on it and reread it and be part of this book coming into the world. And I was, sitting here in the Center for Fiction and thinking about sort of the form of a novel, of book-length fiction, and how we keep returning to it or can't get over it. And thinking about Anne's work as kind of a novel and an essay and a notebook, doing all of those things in one project. Maybe that can become a question about how you come to those forms or combine those different impulses in one book or in one life or any of those.
In other words, how did it come about?
Sure.
Is that what we're saying? Okay. But I should first say that it's been such a pleasure to work with Hilary, and she really, there was a manuscript before Hilary saw it, but it's a book because Hilary saw it, and rescued it, which is the name of the press, Rescue Press. That's very happy. How did it come about? I think that I've been on a trajectory moving toward sentences as statements, as sentences, as paragraphs, I think, really. If you want to agree with that. I think it's all open to discussion. But if I look back 10 years, and if I look back to the previous book of short stories, I think it's not unbelievable that I arrived here. Why does this happen? I think I just keep scraping away everything that seems extraneous, and I end up with just these little bits.
I like how we keep feeling the passage of time so much, so it has that quality of dailiness and moment by moment and living a life, in a body through time, which seems the extraordinary thing to be able to capture within something that also has a larger narrative. So that sense of the moment and of a year or years.
I think that at a certain point in our lives, when enough deaths are happening around us and we're steeped in mortality, steeped more properly in mortality, that's what happens, it's the moments, right? And so I guess this was a collection of those moments, and it did come pretty naturally. I don't think that this is a book I could have written as a young person. Should we turn it around on you, or do you want to pipe in, anybody?
I thought both readings were really beautiful, and I liked the books. The sections that we read were great. I just had a question for you about, I was noticing in the reading there were 2 episodes in Comments on the Darkness. And I was wondering if you just wanted to comment on the darkness. And you saw one episode where you said, I don't want to wait for the day, I wait for the darkness before dawn. And then there was another episode I ended with the light come out of the darkness. Is it just about like depression or like a reflection on like death? Like there were 2 allusions to darkness.
I think that I think that certain images, certain words, certain ways of looking at the world keep coming around again and again in the book, and that's part of what structures it and where it holds it together. And so darkness within 2 of the things that I read just now, there's more darkness. And I don't think I can really comment on the meaning of the darkness, we interpret it in whatever way, but yes, it does, many things keep coming around and around and around.
Oh, I was just thinking, I feel like we don't often kind of talk about or think about that way that, images return in novels or things that are, a work of fiction, but how much their structure is also in a small way about repeating images or images kind of echoing and building on each other, even in ways that you don't quite notice or you only notice a little. I was just reading this beautiful novel, Machine Dreams by Jane Ann Phillips.
That's been around a long time.
Yeah.
You finally got to it?
I got there in time. It's so good, and she keeps returning to this image of a winged horse, and some of it is what is the gas company that has that on their logo? Yeah. And sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's a different kind of image, but it's like that way, it's not, you can't reduce it to one meaning or explanation or reason why that's the image that anchors the novel, but it works really beautifully. Yeah, and I think there's images throughout tribute, right, that we keep coming back to.
Listening to you both, it was interesting how both works in their own way are very, very taken up with the matter of conflict. And, what you so chillingly and beautifully rendered was a conflict that we all think we know about or think we ought to know about or feel that we have access to through news. And of course, so much of the conflict is withheld from us, or we withhold it from ourselves. I'm reading David Finkel's book now. Thank you for observing. And that you through a particular kind of fiction maker's eye render bodies and what happens to bodies, and he does it through a nonfiction, through interviewing people. And I, as the reader, experience both kinds of renderings with this sort of shock of awareness of my own body and others' bodies, and in ways that I don't typically want to conceive of them, because it positions the body in this conflicted space, this horrifying conflicted space. Whereas Anne's work it's the body appears and the conflicts of body and heart appear in a very different register, and yet I'm so aware, mindful and aware too of conflict threading the book, the self sort of asking itself hard questions and arguing with itself sometimes. And so I wondered if either of you could comment on that. Did you talk about that as you came to know each other in a sort of writing-editing relationship that you had?
I think it's something maybe we both recognized in each other, but I don't know if we've Probably
We haven't talked about it.
But, yeah, I don't know if we've ever quite talked about it. I think that was really beautifully expressed so much that I don't know what to add to it except, to say that question of this conflict being a place where bodies were very much at stake, but they were not mine, and of it being a war that we received in such a mediated and distant fashion, and for which the gap between civilians and those who were serving in the war seemed sort of unprecedentedly large. And so in writing the novel, it was sort of an experiment in attention, I hope an experiment with some ethical resonance of some kind, who knows, which was just to say, like, what if that war was sort of immediately disappeared as soon as it started. You could instantly not pay attention to it. And so at the time, I was 22 or something, and I couldn't understand that, and was very outraged by it, and thought, well, what if I just pay attention every day? I'll have this practice of attention, and then I'll write. And this book was born out of that practice. So kind of question of the daily, also of to what we're giving our attention, and then creating something that's a narrative over years that happens day by day through reading reportage, reading the news, watching the news, etc. And thinking about, that active imagination as you think about how this is taking place and how very much you're not there. Was really, and continues to be on my mind.
What do you feel about you as a woman writing in such a male environment? Do you think that tension helps?
I'm not sure what you mean by tension helping. Can you say more about that?
It reminds me of Conrad, writing in English when he's, speaking.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's very interesting to think about. I'm not sure. I don't think I ever really thought about being a woman writer, writing in a more male milieu or something. Just in that, I think war obviously happens very much to women. I've had more occasion to think about it since then, since sometimes I've been on some panels or at events that included a lot of veterans who are writing about the war, and so one thinks sometimes about gender in those settings, because certainly not all, but maybe more of those veterans would happen to be men. But I don't know that I have a clear thought about it, except that it has come to my awareness since then, but not with any, conclusive insight or anything like that. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think I just wrote when I remember what I was going to write.
Could you talk a little bit about your method?
Of writing a novel. It was really, I guess, what I just said of that practice of attention, and also sort of not really thinking about the whole novel for many years of writing it, and just writing these small pieces, figuring they might all become something. Which I don't know if anyone would recommend that as a way of writing a book, to be like, oh, you'll figure it out later. But it seemed important at the time.
To what extent did the daily news seep in as you were writing the parts?
I think my aim was to be as open to it as possible, so as much seeping and steeping as as I could let occur.
And then research?
I guess I was doing some research, but it felt more just like living and reading. It didn't feel as programmatic in a way as research.
It came naturally somehow as part of that.
Yeah, Yeah, I think it was part of just, my life at that moment.
Were there any books in particular that you were reading at the time?
There was, I think, Anthony Shadid's
Did it fall apart? Did it fall
Anthony Shadid's Night Draws Near, which is a really beautiful book. And I don't know if people know that, a nonfiction book he wrote very early in the war in Iraq, and he conducted extensive interviews with people. It's a really lovely project. But I guess I could ask you also about research into psychoanalysis or any of those.
all of it pretty natural, as you say, just whatever I was reading at the time seeped in. Karen?
Yeah, I had a question about when you were talking about translation and things that came in your talk, Anne, and I was thinking about the way in which so much of your work I've always read in terms of how it is and isn't Greek fiction too. And I know that's my own problem, but I just wanted to hear, because one of the things I was thinking also when you were talking, Hilary, about the ways in which certain prosthetics, arms, limbs were repeating in your piece, and how in Anne's piece it was much more about certain sounds, like you would have gull and galley, and you connected a lot of things for us. So I wanted to know about the role of sound, which is a big deal in Greek, but also in yours, and I was interested in how it sort of came into yours formally in this way that sort of struck me as so alliterative compared to Greek fiction, which is so vowely. I was just listening to
So vowely?
Yeah, I was just listening to how you, like, what was your translation? Go ahead.
How would you translate this into Greek?
Yeah.
Get vowely. Well, I wasn't thinking of Greek fiction at all, or poetry, and I really don't read much. I mean, in translation, I've read some. It's been years and years and years since I read Greek poetry.
More just this Greek.
But the Greekness you're talking about, God only knows. This narrative did come to me. The biggest difference between this and what came before is sound. And I think sound guides me at this point. And that's why I don't know what to call it. Sometimes when people say it's poetry, I might agree or disagree. But it's sound. It really is fueled by sound, I think. That's how I feel inside myself. And that was a revelation. That was something that came to me and that I couldn't have gone after at all. Is that answer?
I heard it, but
Okay.
I just was, that's interesting that there was something like that.
Anybody else? Yes, Anya.
Yeah, I would love to hear about I heard a little bit about the start for this project for you, and I'm curious about what was the seed before tribute for you in this?
Before tribute?
Yeah, like what was the impetus, or what was the...
There was no, it was already there before there was any, there was no point when it wasn't there because it just had started and it was already happening. It was already being written. And there was no thought behind. I'm lying. I just realized, actually, it was being written, but I think this particular particular trajectory did come out of a challenge I gave myself. Someone told me to read H.D.'s Tribute to Freud, and the original title was Tribute to Freud after H.D. Well, it was a rivalry, a challenge, a love song, a dirge. And we got rid of that. We decided to just keep tribute. So there was kind of a challenge in reading that. having read it, I decided I wanted to write my own. And I did, and this is what came out of it, so there you go. See, everything, nothing is the full truth. Remember that? We got rid of it? Yeah. Anybody else? I'm going to eat now and drink. Thanks so much.